Welcome to the 18th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast, featuring an interview with Tarquin Hall, author of The Case of the Missing Servant, the first book featuring Vish Puri, India's most private investigator. The Case of the Missing Servant is published by Simon & Schuster and is available in bookstores now.
This is Lee Child, and I'm listening to the Reading and Writing Podcast.
Welcome to the Reading and Writing Podcast. Today I'm happy to be joined by Tarquin Hall, author of the just-released novel, The Case of the Missing Servant, a mystery novel set in India introducing Vish Puri, India's most private investigator. Tarquin, welcome to the Reading and Writing Podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Sure. Well, I wanted to ask, in recent years, mysteries have featured many exotic settings and locales, including, obviously, Alexander McCall Smith's #1 ladies detective agency novels. Also, numerous historical mysteries, including various settings and times, including ancient Rome. I wonder what attracted you to writing a mystery that fully explores the rich setting, background, and characters of modern India.
Well, I'd lived in India for quite a few years, about 5 years to be exact, and I really wanted to write a book about modern India, and I've been thinking about it for quite a long time. There have been a lot of very worthy, very good, many of them, books kind of trying to explain modern India to a Western audience in particular, and these are, non-fiction books, and they're worth reading. But I really wanted to bring out the color, the contrast, the huge change that's going on in the country. And I happened to, in my capacity as a journalist, write an article, a feature for the Sunday Times newspaper in the United Kingdom on Indian detectives. So I met a lot of these private detectives working in India, and they are extraordinary characters. And that really inspired me to write the book. I thought this was the perfect vehicle for explaining modern India.
And as you mentioned, you worked as a journalist, and I know you've published a book, Solemn Brick Lane, which was a memoir of when you moved back to London after many years away. I wonder, had you tried fiction before, or did you just have the idea after you
fiction? I had never written fiction before. I've always done journalism and non-fiction. And so, there's been a lot to learn writing this book. On the other hand, to me, it feels very much like non-fiction again, because what I'm describing is very real. It's today's modern India, which very well. So many of the characters to me seem like non-fiction characters, really. And the world I'm describing, and the way I'm describing it is not that different to the way I'd probably do it in a feature article or in a work of nonfiction.
Sure. And with the Case of the Missing Servant, it's obvious that you're writing about contemporary India. I was wondering, from your observation of India and what you know about it, what are some of the challenges that you think India faces in the next 5 to 10 years? What happens when lower-cost countries start taking over some of the lucrative call center jobs?
Well, India is changing in many ways, and then again, it's not. You've kind of got, grossly overgeneralizing, you've really got two Indias now. And when you hear people, particularly in India, describing it, it kind of depends which India they belong to. Which India they belong to kind of colors, obviously, the description of India you get. There's the India of call centers and software development firms and huge, enormous industries that are fast springing onto the world stage. I mean, we're talking billions and billions of dollars here. And then you've got the India of the 7 people who are still living on less than $2 a day. I think more than half of that are living on something around 50 cents a day. So you've got this enormous contrast. In many ways, I think it's the Indian story all over again. It's kind of more and more segregation, more and more layers and on top of other layers. So you've got this very complex culture that's it's always been complex, but in a way it's getting more and more complex. And you've got extreme poverty and at the same time extraordinary wealth. I suppose the challenge, if you like, for India in the future is going to be to try and create the kind of wealth that plugs that huge gap, that wealth divide. But that's really unlikely to happen unless the politics improve. And India's major problem is its politics. It's utterly corrupt. It's totally non-accountable. And so even the very wealthy who live a very privileged middle-class existence don't have the rule of law on their side. As one of them was saying to me recently, it's the most expensive place to live in the world because you have to provide your own water, electricity, security, schools, health, just about everything.
Wow, so it certainly makes an interesting setting for a mystery novel.
Yeah, it does. In a way, it kind of reminds me of the Victorian London of Sherlock Holmes because in Conan Doyle's day, London had become this enormous city with many people coming from all over the world to live here. I'm in London at the moment, and you'd never had such a huge urban sprawl before, and that threw up a lot of new, interesting, and different kinds of crimes, all sorts of extraordinary scenarios in a city that had grown exponentially for years. And in a way, you've got the same thing happening in Indian cities, and I suppose in other cities around the world as well. I mean, Delhi has grown from when I lived there in the mid 90s. It was something around, I think, 7 or 8 million people. It's always hard to get the exact figures in India. Now it's more than 16 million, and the projection is something like 25 million and beyond. If you look at the whole of the National Capital Region, which is, a sort of term that's used now for Delhi, if you like, it's the second largest human conurbation on Earth, second only to Tokyo, and that's set to grow larger than Tokyo. So it's an extraordinary setting.
Wow, that is. And it's an interesting comparison that you make with the London of Sherlock Holmes. And that actually leads me to my next question, because in the book, Vish, your main character, dismisses Sherlock Holmes as somewhat of an amateur, and he claims that Chanakya, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name correctly, was really the first true detective. I was wondering if you can tell us about that character and who he was in history.
Well, yeah, Vish Puri is, he's Punjabi and he's extremely proud. And, he's very, very capable. He's none too fond of the British period of the Raj, when the British were in India for nearly 300 years. And he's extremely proud of his Indian heritage and his culture. His guru is the political genius Chanakya, who lived 300 years before Christ. He was the founder of the Maurya Empire. And he wrote an extraordinary treatise called the Arthashastra, which basically lays out how to run an empire, how to run a bureaucracy, how to run an economy. And there's also a large section in the book about how to run an intelligence service. And Chanakya founded the world's first intelligence service. He was spymaster. He even goes so far in this book, which, as I say, dates back 2,300 years ago, to give all sorts of recommendations on how a spy should go about his business. So he recommends, for example, that if you have to infiltrate a merchant's house, a good way of doing it is with a dwarf. If you have to get into a foe's court, a rival king's court, maybe you need a nun or a widow, or all these kind of undercover sort of disguises he recommended. And if you talk to some of the Indian detectives, real-life Indian detectives today, they take inspiration from this stuff. A lot of detective work in India still to this day involves undercover work, because India is such a complex culture that it's often the case that if you're from a particular background, maybe a different caste or even a different religion, it's very difficult for you to infiltrate someone else's caste or household or tribe or whatever, because you're going to stand out. So you need people who are very adaptable or come from particular backgrounds who can, I suppose, do your dirty work for you. So I've woven that in. Vish Puri is kind of a unique detective in that he's very proud. I suppose he's a little bit like Poirot, Hercule Poirot, Agatha Christie's creation. But he does recognize that he has to work with other people. Often that's the only way he can get at the information he needs.
That's interesting. And in your conversations with the Indian detectives for the nonfiction article that you wrote, I'm curious if there were any anecdotes or cases that stood out for you from your discussions.
Yeah, I was talking to one detective who was telling me that he needed to find somebody in a village in rural India, and he knew that if he went into this village, several villages, I think, in a particular area, he was looking for somebody. And he said that if he had gone into the villages and asked for the person by name, they would have, nobody would have told him, because everybody would have been wary of him and worried that, he was after something or he had some kind of malicious intent. So he went in disguise with a couple of his United Nations World Health Organization workers disguised as kind of medics to give out free medicines. And they gave out, I don't know, aspirin or paracetamol or something. And in that way they kind of found the person they were looking for, because everybody came to get the free medicine. So that's a sort of typical example. I mean, more typically, I suppose, is that people will send, detectives will send undercover operatives into households. I mean, everybody in India has servants. The servants have servants. And of course, much like, I suppose it used to be in Britain when everyone used to have servants here, the servants know everything. So in a way,
Sure.
What you have to do is kind of befriend them and get them to tell you what's really been going on. And in the book, as in real life, a lot of Indian detectives do matrimonial investigations, which means that they will investigate a prospective brides or grooms in an arranged marriage. And sometimes they'll send somebody into a household to work, maybe as a dishwasher or a adobe cleaning clothes, to find out kind of the character of the girl or the character of the girl or the boy. So I put a lot of that kind of thing in the book.
Sure. That's interesting that if you know the servants, you know what's going on in the house.
Well, as one detective put it to me, he said, the drivers in particular know everything. They overhear everything. I was in India a few months ago, the last time, and somebody was telling me, another detective, that when they do matrimonial work, the first thing they do is always ask the driver. And he was telling me an example of how they'd ask this driver what he thought of his employer, and the guy said, "Oh, don't marry him. He's a drunk. He's always fooling around with other women." So that marriage was completely blown based on what this driver told them. Great.
I'm curious, has the book been published in India yet?
Yeah, it has. Yeah, it's doing very well there, actually. It's on the bestseller list.
And what's the response been? Oh, wow, bestseller list. That's great. And what has the response been? I mean, obviously it's selling well.
It's been extremely good, actually. I was kind of slightly bracing myself because Indians can be touchy about foreigners writing about India. I mean, I think you have to remember with India that it's essentially been occupied up until 1947
Sure.
for 300 years. And before that, a lot of people would say that it was subjugated by Muslim rulers. So people are very sensitive, and you do have to tread carefully. I've been very pleased with the response. It's had some excellent reviews. There was an extremely good review in India Today, which is kind of the Time magazine of India, ringing the book's praises. So overall, it's been great.
That's great. That's great. I was curious about the writing process that you went through for The Case of the Missing Servant. Did you outline the book beforehand, or did you kind of write and see where it took you?
I outlined it up to a point. I mean, when I started off, I really didn't know where I was headed with it. I came up with obviously with the detective. I knew that he'd have these undercover operatives. In fact, I sat down in a coffee house with a notebook, and I've got the notebook here on my shelf. And right on the first page, there are kind of various names for the detective, like Harry Singh, and then Vish Puri actually was one of the options, the second one I think. And then I came up with this idea for these operatives, and I gave them nicknames because Punjabis always give everyone nicknames. So one of them is called Tube Light because he's a little bit slow to flicker on in the morning, and another one is called Flush because he's been the first to have a flush toilet in his village. And that's very typical of my detective Vishpuri. He gives nicknames to everybody. He's a very sort of jovial Punjabi character. So I came up with all that stuff very, very quickly, and I started actually writing the first couple of chapters, which you come in to the book in the middle of a matrimonial investigation, although it seems like you're in the middle of some really kind of sinister crime, perhaps. And I kind of took it from there. I mean, there were things. I took the advice from Stephen King from his book On Writing, which I found excellent. He says he always knows the general idea, but he sort of just wings it, and the story kind of tells itself. I found that a bit at one point. I think it's in chapter 8. I thought that the detective really should be in some kind of danger, so I just had him up on his roof where he grows his chili plants, and I had somebody suddenly start shooting at him. I finished the chapter and I realized I had absolutely no idea who was shooting at him. And I think that's kind of the fun of writing fiction, is you can do that. You can just write something in, and then you kind of have to figure out what the hell's going on.
Figure out who's shooting at him.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious about who are some of the writers that you enjoy reading, and I was wondering if when you were working on The Case of the Missing Servant, were there any books or specific writers that you looked to for inspiration?
It's funny, I haven't read a lot of detective fiction. I mean, I read a certain amount of Agatha Christie when I was growing up, when I was a kid. I absolutely love Sherlock Holmes. I mean, I read all the Sherlock Holmes mysteries. But since then, I don't tend to read a lot of detective fiction. I hadn't. I mean, no one tends to believe this, but because the book has been compared to Alexander McCall Smith's #1 Ladies Detective Agency, but I'd actually never read that. And when I sent the first few chapters to my agent in New York, she said I should read it, and I did, and I very much enjoyed it. But I hadn't actually read it before. I tend to read an awful lot of non-fiction and biography and history. But since I've been doing this, I have started reading a lot of detective fiction novels. And while I was reading The Case of the Missing Servant, believe it or not, I got onto Perry Mason novels. Again, I'd never read them before, but I was attracted by the titles in a bookshop when I was looking for books. And the one I picked up was The Case of the Grinning Gorilla. And I can't remember who wrote it. Eric Stanley Gardner.
Earl Stanley Gardner.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
So I read a bunch of those, and they're kind of formulaic but fun. Since then, I've been reading a lot of thrillers. Recently, I read The Man Who Came In From the Cold, which is brilliant.
Right. Right. I was curious as well. The Case of the Missing Servant, as we've discussed, is set in modern India, and it's the background is very rich and detailed, including at the back of the book you have a glossary. I was wondering, did you have anyone vet the book before you sent it to your agent in terms of getting all of those details correct?
Well, I'm married to a lovely girl who comes from an Indian family. She grew up in the States, mostly in New York and North Carolina, but she's from a Punjabi family. Half of them are still in India, and we've been together 12 years, and I've got to know them very well, obviously. And as I said earlier in the interview, I mean, I spend a lot of time in India. So I have my own kind of expert in-house, if you like. So she's given me a lot of pointers and scolds me when I get spellings and details wrong. She's particularly great on food. I mean, Indians, like Italians or the French, I mean, they love and know their food, and they're very particular about their food. So I've got to know Indian food and love it very well, but she's often sort of introducing me to new kinds of the food in the book, and that comes from her and a lot of family and friends as well.
Great. So has her family read the book yet? What do they think?
Yeah, her mother read it actually the other day and called me and said she loved it, although she was a little bit confused about the plot. But I had to explain exactly what had happened at the end. But she loved it, and yeah, the response from other members of the family have been very good. I mean, I should say that I have a lot of friends in Delhi, and I sent the manuscript before it was published to several of them as well to see what they thought. And I was quite pleased actually. They only came back with a few things that they felt I'd got wrong. So overall, the reaction has been very, very strong, very good.
That's great. That's great. I wondered what advice or suggestions would you offer aspiring writers who may be working on their first novel? What kind of got you through writing your first novel?
Well, that's a big subject, writing. I think it's a strange thing, isn't it? I mean, everybody does it a little bit differently, but I suppose the two main ingredients are imagination. You've got to have it, and you kind of can't do it without both. I mean, if you haven't got imagination or you're not really using your imagination, it's going to be pretty drab stuff. On the other hand, you can have all the imagination in the world and be completely undisciplined and never write a word, and vice versa. So you've just got to sit every day and do it. And at the beginning, it all seems like a great idea. A few weeks in, you sort of think, oh, God, can I really sit here any longer? And you've just got to, it's kind of like lifting weights, I guess. You've just got to work through the pain.
Great. Well, that's all I have for now. Again, you can check out The Case of the Missing Servant. It's in bookstores now by Tarquin Hall. And I did want to ask you, what are you working on now? Do you have another Vishpuri detective novel in the works?
Yeah, I'm working on a second Vishpuri book. It's called The Case of the Man Who Died Laughing. It basically sees Vishpuri on the trail of a god man. And he brings in his operatives again, and once more his mother, his Mummiji, is also on a separate case that kind of runs as a parallel plot through the book. So The Case of the Man Who Died Laughing hopefully will be published next June.
Great. Well, thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thanks for listening to my latest interview. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to leave me some feedback about the podcast, you can leave a voicemail on my Google voicemail line, and I can feature your comment in a future podcast. You can simply call 413-84-BOOKS. That's 413-84-BOOKS. Or it's 413 413-842-6657. Again, that's 413-842-6657. Also, if you enjoyed listening to the podcast, I would love to get a review in iTunes so that more people could find the podcast in the iTunes store. It's very simple. Go to the podcast in the iTunes store and just leave a review or a comment. Thanks a lot, and we'll be back soon with another interview with a writer that you enjoy reading.
This is David Morrell, and when I'm not working on my latest thriller, I'm listening to the Reading and Writing Podcast.
This is Mission Control. The tallest, fastest, and longest steel coaster at Kings Island needs you. Must be able to handle a 300-foot drop and speeds up to 91 miles per hour while dodging meteors. No training required. Are you up for the challenge?
Introducing Orion at Kings Island, one of only 7 gigacoasters in the world.
Right now, everyone pays kids price. Kings Island tickets just $45 online.